So let's dive into the incredible electrical properties of a single neuron. I mean, have you ever really stopped to wonder what's happening inside one of your brain cells when it's just sitting there, supposedly at rest?
Right? You'd probably think it means the cell is switched off, totally quiet, electrically neutral. But as you're about to see, the reality is so much more dynamic than that.
All right, to get a handle on our brain's electricity, we have to start with the fundamental unit, the neuron. You can think of it as the biological wiring that makes pretty much everything happen. And while neurons come in all shapes and sizes, they all play by the same basic electrical rules.
Now, a typical neuron's got a few main components. You've got the soma, that's the cell body, which acts as the command center, keeping the whole operation running. Then you have these fine little wires extending out, the dendrites that receive signals, and the long axon that sends them. But the real star of our show today, the part that makes all this electricity possible, is the outer skin that covers the entire thing, the cell membrane.
Okay, so we're going to zoom way in now, focusing on just a tiny, tiny patch of this membrane. Because this right here, this is where all the incredible electrical action happens, even when the neuron seems to be completely still. So what is it exactly? Well, the cell membrane is essentially a barrier made of lipid molecules, and its most important job is to create a clear separation between the world inside the cell and the environment outside of it. Believe me, this separation is the absolute key to everything that's about to happen. And that brings us right to the heart of our question. When a neuron is at rest, when it's not actively firing off a signal, what's actually going on electrically across that membrane? Your first instinct might be to say, yeah, of course. I mean, if nothing's happening, it must be neutral, right? A perfect balance of positive and negative charges on both sides. Makes sense. But this is where things get really, really cool. A resting neuron is not electrically neutral, not even close. It actually holds a steady, persistent electrical charge, like it's just sitting there brimming with stored electrical energy. And we can actually measure it. If you stick a tiny probe inside the neuron to measure the electrical difference, you'll find a voltage of about -70 millivolts. It's a tiny voltage, for sure, but it is absolutely vital. We call it the resting membrane potential. Okay, but why negative? What's that about? Well, voltage is always a relative measurement, right? It's a difference between 2 points. And by convention, scientists just decided to define the fluid outside the cell as the 0 point, or ground. So that -70 millivolts just means the inside of the cell is 70 millivolts more negative than the outside. Simple as that. So if it holds a voltage, you might be thinking, is a neuron basically just a tiny biological battery? It's actually a great way to start thinking about it, since a battery also stores potential energy as a voltage. But let's see how they really stack up. First, let's just talk about scale. A standard AA battery that you'd put in your remote has a potential of 1.5 volts. Our neuron? Its resting potential is 70 millivolts. And since a millivolt is 1,000th of a volt, the neuron's voltage is actually over 20 times smaller than that everyday battery. But the most important difference, the real game changer, is how they generate that voltage. See, a battery uses chemical reactions to kick off a flow of electrons. A neuron doesn't really use electrons at all. Instead, it generates its voltage by precisely controlling the distribution of different charged particles, called ions, across its membrane. So let's meet these charged particles, the main characters in our story. The source of the neuron's power isn't some messy chemical reaction. It's this incredibly elegant balancing act involving these ions, basically charged atoms floating around both inside and outside the cell. You've got to picture the neuron's environment as this complex, soupy, saltwater solution. It's filled with water, proteins, sugars, and of course, a whole bunch of these charged ions. And it's the carefully maintained imbalance of these specific ions across the membrane that creates the voltage. Now, while there are a lot of different ions involved, there are 4 key players doing most of the heavy lifting to set up that -70 millivolt potential. So how does the cell create that imbalance? This is the cool part. It uses these tiny molecular pumps in its membrane to constantly push sodium ions out and pull potassium ions in. This creates a situation where there's a ton of sodium on the outside and a ton of potassium on the inside, establishing that precise electrical gradient we call the resting potential. And that's really the secret of the resting neuron. It isn't off at all. It's a finely tuned electrical system constantly working to hold this steady negative charge, totally poised and ready for action. Which leaves us with one final pretty exciting question.
If this is what the neuron is doing at rest, what on earth happens when it decides to fire?